Metric today we're going to talk about the one metric that most dividend investors ignore. And so this is going to help us spot tomorrow's dividend growers before they become uh, income streams. All right. So let's go ahead and let's dive on in. All right. So here we go. All right. So what we're going to learn today. Hang on a second here. I need to move this a little bit, get it out of my way. There we go. All right. So what we're going to learn today is one business quality number that tells you whether a company is built to grow its dividend, how to use it to spot tomorrow's dividend growers before they show up on yield screens, and number three, a real company that shows the whole pattern in action. So that's what we're going to kind of work through today. So let's move on to the second slide here. All right. So the metric that we're going to talk about today is ROIC. And we're going to talk about what ROIC actually measures. So ROIC, whoops, I went ahead a little bit. Sorry that. All right. So ROIC is the one number that can tell you whether a business is genuinely good and making money or just good looking at it. The metric is called return on invested capital, and most income investors skip it. So here's the formula. The formula is pretty simple. It's ROIC equals NOPAT divided by invested capital. Yes, I will go over those. Translation, what does that mean in English? So it means how many cents of tax, after tax profit the business squeezes out of every dollar it has working for it. So it has a bar that it has to clear. ROIC has to clear the cost of capital or WACC. So, for example, a 12% ROIC business with an 8% cost of capital creates value. A 6% ROIC business destroys it, even if the profits are rising. So, why is this important for dividend investors? Businesses with high returns on capital can pay dividends without starving the engine. Low ROIC businesses cannot. So, if you're only going to learn one metric this year, make it ROIC. So let's go back and kind of unpack this a little bit. So the formula is pretty simple, right? ROIC equals NOPAT divided by invested capital. But you're probably asking, what are those numbers? So NOPAT stands for net operating profit after taxes. And the way you calculate it is you look on the income statement and you look for operating income or earnings before interest and taxes, EBIT. You look for that number on the income statement and you multiply it by 1 minus the tax rate, and that gives you the NOPAT. It can be equated to similar to free cash flow-ish. It is similar-ish to that, but it's not exactly the same. So that is how you calculate NOPAT, and that's the denominator. So the numerator is going to be invested capital, and the easiest way to calculate that is debt plus equity minus excess cash or minus cash. So if you look on the balance sheet, you would find the total debt of the business, including operating leases. You would also include the shareholders' equity. You add both of those, and then you subtract any cash and cash equivalents. Now, you can get a lot more nuanced with this part of the equation. Michael Bobeson has very, very great details on how to really dig into how to calculate invested capital. You can go the financing route, which is what we're talking about right now, which is the debt and the equity and the cash, or you could go the operating route, which includes looking at the differences between operating the working capital, so current assets versus current liabilities, and then taking into account goodwill and PP&E and all those kinds of line items as well. So there's very, very nuanced ways to look at ROIC. Really, we're looking for an approximate number. You don't need to get it down to the nitty gritty. That can, if you really want to go that deep, you certainly can. For our purposes, we're really looking for the difference between ROIC and WACC or weighted cost of capital. And that is the one of the ways that you can measure how well a company is generating value for us investors. And as we go along, we'll talk about that more. All right. So let's move on to the next kind of question we need to kind of answer. So Why does ROIC beat ROE or return on equity and ROA or return on assets? So return on equity looks great, can look great on a slide. The problem is you can fake it. You can add enough debt to almost any business and ROE goes up, even if the underlying business is getting worse. We'll unpack that here in just a second. So here's the flaw. ROE ignores debt. A leveraged company can post a 20% ROE and a 10% ROIC business. The borrowing flatters the ratio. Return on assets has a flaw as well. It treats every dollar of assets the same, including cash sitting on the balance sheet. So capital light businesses look the same as capital intensive businesses. ROIC fixes this. It uses NOPAT with no debt benefit and invested capital, only money actually working in the business. So two companies with very different balance sheets become comparable. So ROIC is a level playing field, and that's how we should think about it. So why does ROE, why can it be flat, why can it be flattering? So one of the ways that you can kind of decompose, you can do this for all three of these metrics, but ROE, the most common way to break it down is looking at something that's called the DuPont analysis. And there's three different components of that, and one of them includes the debt. And so one of the ways that companies can really boost their return on equity is they will use debt to pump that up. And because you compare that to the revenue and the assets of the business, then the ROE can look artificially higher as the company starts to take on more and more debt. Now, debt in and of itself is not a bad thing, but one of the things that can be damaging to investors is if you're not paying attention to that, it can get out of hand. And you can look at the company and just screen for it and see this fantastic ROE of 50% and not really understanding that they've taken on debt and their debt to equity has maybe grown to 4.0. And now the company could be in trouble if they encounter any sort of bump in the road, shall we say. And return on assets kind of can be the same kind of thing, where return on assets can inflate the number because a company carries a lot of cash on the balance sheet. Berkshire Hathaway would be a fantastic example of this, right? They carry a ton of cash, over 380 billion, I believe, at last report, and that is a drag on the returns. And even Warren Buffett has said that that is a drag on returns. But if you look at their ROA or return on assets, it's very, very high. So that is one of the things that you have to keep in mind. All these metrics have flaws, and we'll talk about the return on invested capital's flaws here in just a moment. But these are things that you have to kind of keep an eye on and think about as you go along and we do this. So one of the other things I wanted to mention too about these other two metrics, return on equity and return on assets both have uses and can be very useful. Return on invested capital is not a great metric to use for financial companies, for example. So things like banks, insurance companies, uh, REITs. These companies, because of their financials and the way that their income statements and balance sheets are set up and organized to reinvest, ROIC does not look great for those companies. So better metrics to use are return on equity and return on assets. And so when you are looking at those kinds of companies, if you see JP Morgan has an ROIC of 2%, but you look at their return on equity and it's 12%, you may think, well, this is a terrible company. It's a different beast. And so sometimes you just have to take these metrics and use them where they're appropriate, just like you would use price to earnings or a PE ratio would not be appropriate for SpaceX's upcoming IPO, where it would be perfectly fine to use it for our company like JP Morgan. So that is why you just kind of need to understand the nuances of some of these metrics and how they can help. But ROIC is a fantastic metric. It's one of my favorites. I've been using it for many, many years. Michael Mauboussin, as I mentioned before, I'll mention him again. He's probably one of the leaders in investigating this and writing about it. And so if you really want to dive into this, I've written about it on Dividend School, but he is also probably the master. So I would definitely check him out if you're interested in learning more about ROIC beyond what we're going to talk about today. All right. So You're probably asking, okay, we've talked a lot about the theory and all those kinds of things. How does high ROIC power a growing dividend? So here's the simple math that most income investors miss. The maximum business can grow without borrowing is its return on invested capital times the share of profits it reinvests. That is the upper limit on dividend growth, too. So growth equals ROIC times reinvestment rate. A 30% ROIC business that reinvests half of its profits has a 15% growth rate. The dividend tie in. So, how does this tie in? The same business can pay out the other half. Earnings grow at 15%, dividends grow alongside. Compounding does the rest. So the flip side, so a 6% ROIC business that wants to grow at 5% has to reinvest almost everything, leaving almost nothing for the dividend, which is why low quality businesses end up cutting the dividend. A high ROIC is what it takes to grow dividends possible in the first place. So let's talk a little bit about some of that math and how this really kind of works. So ROIC times reinvestment rate. You're probably asking, well, okay, we talked about ROIC. What is this whole reinvestment rate idea? What it is what you're looking at is you want to look at how much does the company reinvest in the business. So if the company is reinvesting half of its profits, one of the easiest ways to look at this is we may have heard of a ratio that dividend investors like to throw around a lot. It's called the payout ratio. And what you're doing is you're taking the dividends per share and dividing that by the earnings per share. And that gives you roughly how much money is the company allocating to dividends from the earnings of the business. And in theory, the whatever is left over, they can use to reinvest back in the business. And so how you can calculate how fast the company can grow is you take that ROIC and you divide that by, or I'm sorry, multiply that by the reinvestment rate. So if a company like, I'll just throw out an example. If a company is paying a 60% payout ratio, that means it has 40% left over to reinvest in the business. So if the company is a young and growing company, it may have a much, much lower payout ratio, which means they have far more money to reinvest in the business. And if it's a younger business, that may make a lot of sense, right? To grow, they need to reinvest. So they need to put more money towards reinvestment opportunities. Where if a company is a little more mature, let's say Procter and Gamble or Johnson and Johnson or even Coca-Cola, which have much higher payout ratios, 60, 70, 80% in some cases, then they have less money to reinvest, but they're also at a different stage of their development. Coca-Cola doesn't really at this point need to invest a lot of money to grow the business. They need to focus on paying a dividend and capital returns for investors. That's why people invest in Coca-Cola because they're interested in what money they're going to get from that investment. How quickly are they going to pay us back? Whereas if you invest in a company like a younger company like Meta, which is just started paying a dividend, that company is really more focused on growth. And so the return that you're looking for from Meta is more about the capital or the growth of the business, the share price appreciation, as opposed to the capital returns that you would get like for share buybacks or dividends in that case. So this is where looking at high ROIC companies can really help give you a clue of how much the company is going to continue to grow its dividend and how much room they have to continue to grow. And that's why our high ROIC companies are fantastic ones to look for when you're trying to screen for dividend companies. So it kind of looks beyond the yield that we would want. All right, so let's move on to the next one. So the trick. So here's the trick. We want to use ROIC to predict dividend growth. So you don't need a crystal ball to spot tomorrow's dividends. You need a 5-year ROIC chart and a payout ratio. Together, they'll tell you almost everything you need to know. So what to look for? So look for an ROIC above 15% in every year for the past 5 to 10 years. Steady matters more than a single peak number because growing dividends need a steady engine. Check the payout headroom. A low payout headroom ratio at the top of a high ROIC means the dividend has years of runway without stretching the company. We want to look at incremental returns. If return on an incremental invested capital, ROIIC, is holding up or improving, the company still has profitable places to put new dollars, which is fuel for future ratios. So a high and steady ROIC plus headroom is the payout. In the payout is the signal that we're looking for. So let's unpack the high ROIC number that we were just talking about. When you're screening for companies, first of all, when we're screening for companies, ideally you want to find a company that's paying at least 15% ROIC. That may not be possible, and you can also lower that bar depending on where the company is in their growth cycle. So if a company is maybe on the more mature side, it may have a lower ROIC. As some of it will depend on the business model as well. So those are all things to keep in mind. You can't compare apples to apples. You can't compare apples ROIC to an ROIC for Procter& and Gamble, for example. They're not apples to apples. Or looking at the ROIC for Union Pacific, the railroad. You can't look at their ROIC because it's very capital intensive versus the ROIC for a company like Mastercard, for example, which is very capital light. So you want to screen and look for companies, and the trend is your friend. So anything above, you want to look for at least 5 year runs of high ROIC. And again, we want to think back to our earlier discussion about the discount rate or WACC or cost of capital. Those are all interchangeable terms. We want all three of those to sit roughly in the same range. And so you want to see a high ROIC compared to the WACC or the cost of capital, and you want to see it at least steady or growing over the last 5 to 10 years. It could be really easy to get excited about a 1 year bump in ROIC for a company, but that's noise. It doesn't indicate that the company is operating efficiently and has lots of reinvestment runway. And so that's why looking at a longer trend is going to be very, very helpful. Same with the payout ratio. You want to look at a payout ratio that has trended roughly in the same range over the same period. That gives you indications that the company is reinvesting really well and is also paying a good dividend that has room to continue to grow. Ideally, you'd like to look for one under 60%, but that is not always necessary. Again, these are just frameworks that you can use to kind of set guidelines for you, but you can adjust as you feel comfortable with your knowledge of the businesses, the types of businesses you're looking for, and where they kind of sit in their evolution of growth versus more maturity and paying out in versus anything else. So those are all things to consider. It's not none of these are just black and white ways to look at. No, this next thing I want to talk about is incremental ROIC, or what's known as ROIIC. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's return on incremental invested capital. And this is actually really simple. It looks scary, but it's actually really simple. And what you would want to do is you would want to look at the NOPAT in year one, and you'd want to look at the NOPAT in year five. And then you'd want to compare those numbers. You'd basically want to subtract year five from year one, and whatever that number is would be your numerator. Then you'd want to do the exact same thing for the invested capital. You do the same thing, you calculate it for year one and year five. Then you subtract year five from year one. Then we take those numbers that are left over, the difference in NOPAT and the difference in invested capital, and you divide those just like you would for ROIC. And that would give you the ROIIC, or the return on incremental invested capital. And sometimes that number can be much, much higher than the ROIC. Don't let that throw you off. That just means that the company is doing a really, really, really good job of investing and growing the business. And that's ideally what you want to see. So this is I guess, a second check to see how well a company is reinvesting for their business. And that's one of the ways that you can spot really, really great businesses as you go along. So that is the trick to using ROIC to help us predict dividend growth. We want to look at a high ROIC, we want to look at a payout ratio, and we want to see those over trends. And then we want to multiply that, and that will give you a reinvestment, a growth rate of how much the company could continue to grow in the future. All right. So as I mentioned earlier that ROIC can mislead, and here's where it can mislead. So ROIC is unquestionably powerful, but it can mislead us with a face value or a fake value. So three traps that most investors miss when they first start using it. Number one is goodwill from acquisitions. They can inflate invested capital and it can pull ROIC down. So the best practice is to calculate ROIC both with and without goodwill to see the true operating economics. This is a tip I picked up from Michael Mauboussin. When you're looking at the asset side of invested capital, that calculation you want to do with goodwill and without goodwill. Serial compounders, companies like Brown& and Brown, companies like Fiserv, companies like Constellation Software. These companies tend to have lower ROICs because they have maybe not Constellation Software, but companies that acquire a lot. Thermo Fisher, for example, Danaher. These are serial acquirers. They have very low ROICs. If you calculate them without goodwill, you will see a higher ROIC. Uh, R&D heavy tech and pharma companies can look worse than they are on raw ROIC because R&D is expensed instead of capitalized. So capitalize R&D over its useful life for a fairer picture. That's a little more inside baseball. And 1 year of ROIC is noise. Use a 5 to 10 year average and watch the trend. A stable mid-20s ROIC tells a much cleaner story than a single 35% reading. So the trend matters more in a snapshot, and adjustments matter more than the raw numbers. So let's unpack a couple of those things really quickly. We talked a little bit about the goodwill. Companies that are tech heavy, like a Microsoft, a Google, for example, those are really good examples. They spend a lot of money. They spend billions, tens of billions of dollars on R&D. And the trouble with that is that it artificially lowers the ROIC because it's expensed immediately. But in reality, the money that they're spending on developing things in the R&D line item on the income statement may not show up for many, many, many years in the income statement, or it might not show up in the profits because they're spending all this money and it's not leading to growth. An easy example for Google would be Waymo. The company has spent, countless billions on Waymo through the years, but they're just now starting to generate money from that investment. But they've had to expense because of accounting rules. Through the years, they've had to expense all that money they've invested, but now they're starting to see a return on that spend. And that's why when you're looking at companies like this, you can, again, going back to Michael Mauboussin, he has a method of capitalizing R&D. Again, this is very much inside baseball. So if this is all new to you, just kind of skip over this part because it's a little inside baseball. It can be a little bit confusing, but these are things that you need to think about when we're looking at ROIC and looking at. That's why understanding the business and looking at the business is so important. I mentioned Thermo Fisher and Danaher. These are both dividend-paying companies, companies that have been around for a long time, and they're strong, quality businesses. But if you look at their ROIC and screen for them, you're going to think, "Ooh, yuck, this is terrible." And in large part, that's because of the way the income statements are set up, and the balance sheets, and the way ROIC is calculated and measured. And because the companies they write a fair amount of their overpay, if you will, for businesses into goodwill on the balance sheet, that lowers their ROIC. And really what we want to look at when we're looking at ROIC for any company is we want to see how well they reinvest, but we also want to measure the operations of the business. And that's what ROIC is really looking at. And goodwill can skew that. And so companies that maybe have a huge one-time purchase and have a huge balloon on ROIC on their balance sheet, that could really throw off what their true operating economics are for the business. And so that's why it's important to take all of these into consideration. And that's why it's also important to understand, again, the business, understand the the mechanics of how ROIC is calculated and how they connect to the income statement and the balance sheet. And when you do all those things together, it gives you a really clean, clear picture of kind of what's going on with the business and how well the company is growing. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, so let's take a look at Visa. So let's put it all together. So let me show you how this works on a real company. So Visa scores very well on every part of this framework, and that's why its dividend growth is almost mechanical. So the ROIC engine for Visa, it's return on incremental invested capital, or the ROIIC we mentioned earlier, sat around 44% over the last 5 years, which is well above its cost of capital, which hovers around 8.5 to 9%. And their ROIC 5-year average, according to fiscal.ai, is hovering around 27, 28%. So the company needs very little debt to fund growth. Uh, Visa does pay out a small share of its earnings. The dividend has decades of runway. The company has raised its dividend roughly 13% in 2024 and roughly 14% in 2025. So Visa definitely passes the business quality test. It's a global payments network with a massive scale, and it has a real moat, the kind of engine that turns reinvestment dollars into rising dividends without breaking a sweat. So the conclusion I would come to about Visa is a high ROIC, a low payout, durable business. And that is a trick. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And those are the kinds of things that we want to look at. So I want to talk a few minutes about Visa. Yesterday, those of you maybe closely following the market may have seen that payments, in particular Visa, MasterCard, anything related to payments, got smashed yesterday. And this has been an ongoing issue or theme, if you will. And there are a multiple of reasons why this is happening. Number one is there is fear around stablecoins. Stablecoins are being adopted very quickly. And they're being used, particularly in the finance space, i.e., banks are starting to use it more and more to transmit cross border monies. So when companies want to transfer money across borders, they're doing it through stable coins as opposed to the normal banking routes, which would be like Swift and things of that nature. And that in and of itself does not impact Visa or Mastercard directly. But what it does do is it puts pressure on companies like Wise and Remitly and other companies to kind of circumvent what's going on with those companies. Now, Visa and MasterCard are working closely with the stablecoin businesses and trying to enable that on their networks. And I guess the other kind of tidbit that I'll throw out there, the latest two earnings calls for Visa and MasterCard, they were of course asked about the stablecoin threat, and both of them, both CEOs mentioned that they are not seeing uh, in their networks, they are not seeing any impact directly of stablecoins on the retail usage. So when you and I, for example, go and buy gasoline or a Coke Zero, my favorite, at a gas station, we are not using stablecoins to make those purchases. We are using our credit cards or our debit cards. And so we're not really seeing a lot of usage on I guess, the retail level, but on the enterprise level, they are seeing it. Now, one of the threats that is something we definitely need to watch is that the big companies, Amazon, Walmart, Target, some of these huge retail businesses that generate, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. Amazon and Walmart are pushing 700 billion in annual revenue. Those companies are looking at using the stable coins as a way of routing money from, instead of using the rails of Visa or MasterCard, of using those to route them to their banks. And so that is something that is worthy of paying attention to. There are also all kinds of government agencies that are putting together threats such as PICs, and I'm going to blank on the one in India, darn it. But Europe just is creating one called Wero, and it would be a system that could circumvent Visa and Mastercard. Now, adoption is probably going to be very, very slow in Europe, just like in the United States, but now has been brutally slow, and that has really not made much of an impact at all. And I guess the last probably thing to consider is regulation, and I think that's probably the bigger concern or the bigger threat, if you will, is regulation. Now, here in the United States, there has been an ongoing um, negotiation in Congress to enact uh, limits on how much Visa and Mastercard can charge for you put again basically a cap on how much they can charge, as well as forcing retailers to not forcing, but enabling retailers to allow these companies to direct their payments the way they want to. In other words, instead of using a credit card, which is a higher fee, they could use a debit card maybe, or maybe bank to bank or account to account payment option, which would have a lower fee. Now, the likelihood of that aspect of it passing is probably slim to none, because as all of us will attest to, when you go pay for something, the last thing we want to do is spend another 5 to 10 seconds deciding on which way I want to pay. We don't really care. We just want to slide our card, we want to get our stuff, and we want to go. And the Durbin Amendment, which was passed a few years ago, put a cap on debit cards with the intention of lowering costs for consumers. But study after study after study has proven that retailers, instead of giving the retailer or the consumer a benefit or a cost benefit, they instead just pocketed the difference. And so that was a big nothing burger, if you will. It did impact the financial business, but anyway, all that to say, Visa and Mastercard are they're being re-rated, and so companies that used to trade at 35 PEs are now probably going to trade at 20 to 25 PEs. So it is something to keep in mind as we go forward. All right, so I guess if we were to learn anything today, I want you to take this away from today's discussion. A durable dividend growth comes from businesses with high and stable returns on invested capital. If you take away nothing else from today, take away that and the fact that if you aren't familiar with ROIC, please go out and learn more about ROIC either through my writing or through Michael Mobuson's writing. Go find an ROIC engine, then check the payout headroom for runway. Companies that you'll see me talk a lot about, Visa, Mastercard, maybe S&P Global, maybe Moody's. These are companies that maybe don't necessarily pay a high yield, but they have a long, long runway for continued revenue growth, and over time that will do its work. So try to hold the best engines long enough for the math to do its work. Compounding is a fantastic business, a fantastic way to invest. And if you just, as Charlie Munger said, if we just stay out of the way, the company will continue to do well over time. All right. So I guess the last thing I'd like to talk about is I've been running a promo for the last week or so. And if you've seen the emails, this is a little bit of kind of what is going on and what we're doing here. So if you take a look at if you go to dividend.school.com, you'll see our website and what what basically what people are going to get if you subscribe to the paid service is you're going to get 5 buy first stocks. These are my highest conviction dividend picks, and this is a preview of what's going to be coming. And the 5 buy first stocks, think of it as your anchor. If you're new to building a dividend portfolio, or if you're looking to start a dividend portfolio, you're not sure where to start, these are the companies that I would recommend that you start with. There's a wide range of companies in this group, and these are strong, consistent dividend payers, many of them which follow all the rules that we are talking about today. Every month, I'm going to send you an email that's going to have the 5 best buys every month. You'll get the name, you'll get the yield, you get the idea and why, and you'll also get the buy below price. So not only will I tell you what companies I think are the strongest buys right now in the market, I will also give you a good suggestion of when to buy below the price. So if you're looking to dollar cost average into a particular name, it gives you a range of prices that you can look at. So if you want to buy a little bit now, maybe a little bit the next month, and so on, and build into a position, you have the access to that. I have a full dividend universe, so these are every stock that I'm following. Not all of these are going to be best buys immediately, obviously, and not all of them are going to be buy first stocks. The buy first stocks are included in the dividend universe, but these are all the companies that I'm watching and are all the companies that I will be sending you updates on every other week. So when earnings season is going on, I will give you updates on what's going on with the company and the earnings. If there's a change in the thesis, if there's a news, if the CFO leaves or the CEO leaves, or they raise their dividend or they cut their dividend, all the news that are associated with this dividend universe, I will let you know what's going on. You also have a safety score, so you can see how safe I think the dividend is, as well as a fair value. So if you disagree with my thesis, you can look at the company and decide, well, I like what Dave's saying, but I think this is a really good opportunity now. You can take a bite of that as well. And then also along with all this, you also get a monthly deep dive. So every month, I will send you a full case description of a business all the way through its valuation. I will use Stock Simplifier, which is one of my favorite tools, as well as Fiscal.ai, and these are tools that I use to investigate and analyze companies. And so this will be a full investment case. Typically, it'll be in the 4 to 6,000 word range. It'll have lots of charts, lots of visuals, and these are something that you probably want to sit down with a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, as it may be, and take a drive through it. In a lot of cases, these will be companies that are included in the dividend universe. Sometimes they will be ones that are outside that I'm interested in, but maybe don't meet the qualifications or the criteria quite yet to be included. So that's everything that's included in Dividend School, as well as the library of all the infographics that I've been creating. There's over 200 plus infographics. So if you're a visual learner like this guy, that's a really great way to try to learn more about the companies and how to invest and how to learn about the metrics like ROIC and income statements and all things finance related. So that's the basic gist of everything today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today, and I appreciate everyone that showed up. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and take a real quick look here and see if anybody is got any questions. I see there are a few questions here, and okay. All right, so I got this great question from Roger. I'll go ahead and take a swing at that. So it's, what is your opinion on screening for single stock dividend payers versus high yield or aristocrat ETFs? Some context from my region, UK, which has a lot of high dividend paying companies. So I'll be blunt. I am not super up on the UK. Obviously, great country, and you do have a lot of great companies that are there. One of the things that I like to look at when I'm looking at these different businesses is I think that I like the flexibility and the ability uh, to I guess control my own destiny, and that's why I like to use single stocks versus ETFs. I have nothing against ETFs. They are a fantastic investment vehicle, and it's a great way for most people to invest. I think I think Warren Buffett said 90%. I would probably easily agree with that. Part of the challenge with investing in single stocks is there's a lot to know and there's a lot to learn, and it's not an easy game to play. And my goal is not to beat the S&P 500. If that's your goal, then the bar is a lot higher. My goal is to earn income to support my lifestyle when I retire. I'm 59, going to be 60 very soon, and so I'm on a different path than maybe somebody that's 25. And so ETFs, so single stocks for me are a way that I choose to try to control my destiny. And it allows me to invest in the things that I want to invest in. It also helps me avoid the things I don't want to invest in. So I, for example, am very against smoking, for example. I'm not putting aspersions on anybody. This is just my personal opinion. I'm very against smoking. And so I don't want to invest in a company like Altria. And, it's a great company, obviously, a high dividend payer. Obviously, everybody that's in the dividend world likes the company. I just don't want to invest in it. And I don't want to give them my money. So if there's an ETF that has that company, which they probably will, have that company in one of these dividend ETFs, then I'm in tacit giving this company money, and I just choose not to do that. And so by choosing individual stocks, I can control my destiny. Another thing that can be very interesting as well is that a company like I'm gonna blank on the an ETF like, the Schwab one, SCHD, which is very, very popular here in the US. That is a fantastic, dividend paying ETF, and they have great criteria. They have tons of strong companies in there. However, they have some rules that exclude things like REITs. It excludes some of the high-tech businesses. It excludes some of the lower yielding businesses like a Visa or MasterCard, which are two of my favorite companies. And so if I'm investing in that ETF, I don't get to partake in a company like Income Realty, which is a REIT, or I don't get to partake in a company like a Microsoft, which is one of the strongest businesses in the world. I don't get to partake in that. And so that is why I choose not to use ETFs personally. But I think a great way, like if you're newer to this whole game and you're like, I don't know about these picking individual stocks, or maybe you have a really growth oriented portfolio, but you want to have something more secure, air quote secure or stable. A fantastic idea is to use something like the SCHD ETF as an anchor. So let's say, just throw out easy rough-ish numbers. Say you take 30% and allocate it to SHD. And then you can take the other 70% and allocate it to anything you want. And if you're younger, you have all those years of compounding on the ETF to continue to grow your portfolio, while you can take home run swings at companies like SpaceX IPO or Anthropic IPO if it ever happens. Any of those kinds of things. If you want to take a swing at those, you absolutely can do that. One of the things that I have learned over the years about investing is that some people get this mistaken idea that they can only invest in ETFs or they can only invest in individual stocks. The world is your oyster. You can mix and match however you choose to do it. If you want to invest entirely here in the US, entirely in your 401k, and have a small brokerage account where you play with individual stocks, you can absolutely do that. If you want to have 50% ETFs and 50% individual stocks, you can absolutely do that. If you want to have 100% ETFs and have 10 different ETFs. You can absolutely do that. So there are a million different ways, and there is no if you go on social media, this is one thing I'll get on my soapbox about for just a second. If you go on social media, a lot of times you'll see people that are talking about absolutes, or they're talking like they have absolutes. There are no absolutes in the stock market. If you invest long enough, the market will humble you very, very, very quickly. And there are no absolutes, and there is no right or wrong way to do it. It all comes down to, what are you comfortable with? How much time do you want to spend on this? And what works best for your situation? And that is really the crux of the whole thing, is what works best for your situation. How do you want to invest, and how much time do you want to put into this? For me, it's an intellectual exercise. I love the challenge of learning about a company like a Danaher, or maybe a more complicated company like a Berkshire Hathaway. I love that challenge. And so it's an intellectual exercise. Not everybody likes that. Some people are like, okay, I know I need to invest. I got half an hour a month because I got 3 kids, a job, and a hobby, and a sports team that I coach. All these things, life gets in the way. So trying to investigate Berkshire Hathaway and all the intricacies of the insurance business probably isn't in their best interest. So investing in ETFs is a fantastic way to go. So all this is a long way to say that I think you need to figure out A, what works best for you, what is gonna fit your investing lifestyle, and what is your goals, and then go forward with it and try to figure out a mix that's gonna work best for you. Aristocrat type ETFs are fantastic, high yield can be great as well. I just never encourage anybody to go 100% hog in all on one thing, especially if things are higher risk. I'm more risk averse, so you can kinda take that for what it's worth, but that's kind of the way that I try to look at. So, Roger, I hope that helps answer your question. So, with that, we've been going on for about 45 minutes here. I'm going to go ahead and respect everybody's time, and I'm going to go ahead and sign us off. I appreciate everybody coming to today, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. If you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to you can send me questions on the email. This will go out in an email probably tomorrow. I've emailed you all enough today. Sorry about the two extra emails. So we will get an email with this tomorrow so you can view it at your pleasure. And you just simply need to reply if you have a question or if I didn't answer something correctly for you today. So with that, by the way, next week we will have another live session at 10 a.m. This will be a regular thing that we're doing and it's free. So you can come anytime. And I hope you enjoyed the show. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign us off. You guys take care, and I'll see you next week.